My paper for today is What Does God Say When in Silence? An invitation to understand God's silence during the pandemic. Preliminary issues. Pandemic does exist. It affects the whole population of the world. The situation is in God's attention. As He knows about every hair of us, He certainly knows about this severe crisis. God is in control of this situation, and this crisis has a meaning and a purpose for every single human. Facts and challenges. There is no neutral zone, no medical equivalent of wartime Switzerland, where you could escape for a while, relax, or ponder what ought to be done. So, does anybody know what's going on? Why is this happening? Is someone trying to tell us something? What are we supposed to do about it? A brief back into the ancient world. In most of the ancient world and many parts of the modern world too, major disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, fires, plagues are regularly associated with angry gods. Sometimes something has happened, must be because someone has it in for you. In the old pagan world of Greece and Rome, the assumption was that you hadn't offered the right sacrifices, or you hadn't said the right prayers, or you did something so truly dreadful that even the old immoral gods of Mount Olympus felt it was time to crack down on you. Philosophical alternatives, the Stoics, everything is programmed to turn out the way it does. You can't change it, just learn how to fit in the situation. The Epicureans, as an alternative, everything is random. You can't do anything about it. Make yourself as comfortable as you can. Carpe diem. The Platonists, present life as a shadow of reality. Bad things happen here, but we are destined for a different world. The modern equivalents. Some just want to tough it out. If the bullets got your name on it, so be it. This would be the Stoics. Most of the modern Western is implicitly Epicurean. Stuff happens, but we want to scramble for comfort. So settle down, self-isolate, plenty of Netflix. This will also pass. Some, including some Christians, opt for Plato. That isn't the worst that can happen. We are heading somewhere else anyway. All right, let's be sensitive, but don't shut down the churches. Meanwhile, in the refugee camps, in the multi-story tower blocks, in the slums and the souks, the suffering gets worse, and the sorrow rises from the whole world like a pale of smoke, shaping the question we hardly dare ask: why? Actually, the best answer to be heard in the last few weeks or months has not been the question why. It has been to the question what. What can we do? Is there someone around the unique, concise, and articulated answer? As my main research theme, also previewed in the title, is the silence of God, I will try a brief view of how God's silence can apply to this pandemic situation. This might be an alternative to such a big amount of voices or noises that surrounds us in our days, like conspirational plans, anti-vaccine movements, a cold interest that generates the pandemic apocalyptic scenario. Sorry. The silence of God. God can be known by his voice, but also by his silence. The subject of this research regards man's search for God's knowing through the lens of the dynamic of his speaking and his silence. God shows himself through everything he does, through everything he generates, through everything he says. Finding the meanings of his divine silence gets us close in knowing his will. Beside God's voice through Bible, the man benefits the same substantial message through God's silence. He often chooses such moments of silence to show the word or to an individual a deep, hidden, precious message. The voice of silence. The biblical silence is not the sign of an absence, but of a presence. God's silence is powerful because it reveals God's nature and it changes inner man. This research paper offers a biblical theological perspective which emphasizes the biblical text. The core of this research is given by the ways God chooses to keep silence in order to communicate his thoughts and plans to the man. A short typology of God's silence. The silence of a word and an ounce is found only in short events, revealing a silence that was not anticipated. There are only a few moments in silence. This type of silence is not oppressive, not exhausting. This is why the reader does not pay too much attention. The silence that precedes the covenant. Every significant covenant between God and man presented in the Bible is preceded by a deep meaning moment of silence. The silence is a curse. This silence is oppressive, even threatening. It is a curse that has come as a consequence. With the last post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the rabbinic tradition records the withdrawal of Ruach HaKodesh, the voice of God. God stops talking. He chooses to wrap himself in silence. The presence of his voice was not useful to the people, so God chooses to send them a much more serious message using his silence. He does it during the Old Testament as an alarm signal for the people, and he does it in the intertestamental period. This is recorded in rabbinic writings. Although this type of silence might be considered I am to talk about, considering the pandemic issue, I choose not to assume the role of a judge, but to go further for a deeper level of understanding the silence of God. The world has committed a lot of sins, and God has the right to use a pandemic in order to turn us all to his paths. But the focus will be on other type of silence, which is Akedah silence. The Jewish concept of Akedah cannot be translated. It refers to suffering fully extended, a suffering sometimes irrational, as it is accompanied by a feeling of dropout felt by the one in suffering. This connection is strictly religious and the reporting is straight to God. The term occurred from the need of expressing the unparalleled sacrifice by Abraham, who accepted to sacrifice his son for God's sakes. Genesis chapter 21, verse 1 to 19. This passage is unique through the whole Bible. It is suggestive for this approach. The technique used is dramatic and intense. Until the last moment, the reader is kept on tenterhooks. Will Abraham sacrifice his son or not? Something is about this uncertainty, the character of divine interruption that is along the reader. Between the moment when God is silenced and the moment when he speaks again in verse 11, the silence is accompanied by an essential function with a transitional function. As Martin Buber mentions, he is only about God's eclipse, not an absence. The word is silence, but it is not dead, and it will end up with a callback. Choosing this term of eclipse is suggestive. This word suggests a mathematical, astronomical precision as a cosmical event that can be precisely evaluated. God's intervention is calculated in detail. There are no details to remain outside. When the word is abolished, everything is already computed to reappear because this was the purpose of saying the word. God sought Abraham and told him. This prevention warning is available only in the context of testing Abraham. Consequently, this scene is already predefined. The tension on the reader is immense, but the reader already knows that God will show up again. The hidden word will be clear again. There is a mark of questioning tough. If God's intervention would have come too late and Abraham would have said, "Too late, God, the child is already dead," this is why waiting has to be short. Testing is only for a short period. The unity of time must be fully respected. Abraham had to wait, as Akedah says, only 3 days. In the third days, Abraham lifted up his eyes and spotted the place far away. This is not a random number. Hosea introduces the idea of renewal after 3 days. After 2 days, will he revive us? In the third day, he will raise us up, and we shall live in this sight. Hosea 6, verse 2. For the Christian people, this number is even more significant. Messiah resurrected after 3 days when he mentioned that people will get a sign to believe. And when the people were gathered together, he began to say, "This is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and there shall no sign be given it, but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so shall also the Son of Man be to this generation." Luke 11. No matter what happens through these days, by the end, resurrection is done. God's eclipse takes 3 days. You must wait patiently because it is perfect timing. God's voice will interfere. If Akedah will take longer, nothing would have stopped the fatality to happen, as we previously mentioned. Isaac foreshadows the sacrifice of Jesus. Abraham is the foreshadow of the sacrificing love of God. For Jesus' followers, the lamb was sacrificed and the parting time from God got to an end. He fulfilled for us everything, but we have to fulfill along God our own Akedah. We are hidden with him in God. We are children and heirs if we fulfill along him our Akedah. This connection by the altar has to exist for all Christ's followers. Sacrifice is needed so we can be glorified through us. Consider these two aspects of Akedah. The precision of God's intervention is accurate in the shortness of time. Along with Abraham, the Old Testament captures other episodes of Akedah. The actors of Joseph and Job, like their father Isaac, they take turns experiencing the silence of God. This time, however, the two previously identified distinctive signs are missing: the mathematical precision and the shortness of the sequence. Concerning them, God is silenced during several chapters of the Bible, respectively a very long amount of time. Jacob and Joseph are separated 22 years, while Job sits under the pressure for 45 years, according to Midrash estimates. However generous the margin or error may be, silence covers the two characters through a thick slice of life. The silence of God is no longer an interruption, an eclipse. At first glance, we might think that Job is framed within the eclipse of God's presence. From chapter 2 to the book of chapter 37, God suspends his appearance. The scheme is that of the Akedah, except for the elements already identified, that the interval of silence is tranquilly long that in the end, the reader can barely breathe a sigh of relief that Job did not die of illness, tumor, or old age along the way. Unlike the other structures, even that of Joseph in Job, this element is difficult to ingest. God makes a kind of covenant with Satan on behalf of Job without even whispering his intentions. The drama of Job, beyond the pain of loss and illness, is first and foremost the drama of the inability to penetrate the thought, to pierce the meaning of God. God's silence has a cathartic role on Job. Although he is praised by God before the heavenly assembly, yet in the end Job reaches the true knowledge of God. My ear had heard of thee, but now my eye hath seen thee. Job 42, verse 5. As conclusion, during a pandemic, people might need to hear the voice of God to claim firmly what is to be done. The silence of God is not an absence of Him, but a presence. People who are used to walk with God will understand the meaning of His silence. And the silence of God speaks about repentance for those who need it, and it is also a privilege to know God deeply. Abraham knew that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Hebrews 11, verse 19. Thank you very much.